Well, and actually speaking about life being what you want it to be, and as we've touched on, identity being in so many ways a constructed thing, certainly from the perspective of the viewer, as it were. We're only ever in the present, looking backwards. Uh, a related issue to this Cheddar Man research has been the question of what the current British population is and how that relates to our story over a long period of time. And a key element of the research that came out of the paper that identified Cheddar Man as a blue-eyed, very dark-skinned human being is that there were around about two waves, it suggested, of migration over the past 10,000 years that have affected how we look, how we are in terms of our body, how stocky and how tall we are, this kind of thing, and crucially, genetically, how we are made up. In particular, for example, on this island. So people have been throwing around very dramatic headlines like "Ancient Britons replaced by newcomers." Other people I saw going so far as to say that there was a some sort of like a megalithic tragedy that took place, some sort of genocide almost in the Neolithic. What do you take from this as a statement about what it is to be British?
Well, he's always been quoted with the in terms of identity, where Dr. Johnson said that patriotism is the last refuge of the scoundrel, and I think we can extrapolate that identity. Politics is also the last refuge of many scoundrels, and I think it's impossible to see this without. I mean, one of the problems in discussing these issues rationally and academically is that in the wider political and social context, anything that's to do with racial identity is seen in the light of the 20th century genocides, the Holocaust, the Armenian massacres, Rwanda, Bosnia.
And also in that sense, the flawed philosophies that drove that. So the idea that there are things like an Aryan race and this kind
absolutely,
of thing.
Absolutely. And one of my before there was Indiana Jones, there was Pimpernel Smith in Leslie Howard's film made in the which was updated the story of the Scarlet Pimpernel to a British archaeologist working in Nazi Germany immediately before the war and helping refugees to escape from the Gestapo. And at the conclusion of that, Professor Smith tells the Nazis, "Oh, by the way, that Aryan race that you've been researching, it didn't exist." It's one of the key pieces of archaeological cinema, popular culture, even more than indie, I have to say.
And see, I think this is something that I've taken away from this story is that one of the key migration elements that built the modern British population comes in with the Beaker people. Now, the Beaker people, they're not related to the Muppet, yeah. They are and have been for a long time, identified as being people possibly connected with a burial type, and in particular a type of pottery, a beaker, that's often associated with these people as they're buried in the grave.
Carry on talking about. I'm just going to go off camera for a second.
Oh yeah, okay. I wonder if I might be buried with this, perhaps. Who knows? This could be my.
Here is a visual aid I should have prepared earlier.
Okay, lift it up a little bit so it's in view. There we go. A beaker. There we go. There is a beaker. Now, what's interesting though is that you're talking about these questions about the Aryan race and sort of the early 20th century concepts about how we came to be, and yet this research actually is in fact reinforcing one of those ideas. It's reinforcing this idea of it's an idea that was actually out of date or certainly was unfashionable in archaeology for quite a while, and that is the culture historical model. The idea that actually you can trace cultures by for example, the material culture that they produce, and in particular the pottery that they produce. certainly when I was introduced to this question of what happened when it came to the Bell Beaker pottery coming into Britain, there was a huge debate about whether or not that represented a movement of people, or whether that was actually the movement of an idea. People were sharing, for example, cups which they quite liked with their neighbours, and this was spreading across a continent, along with a series of related ideas, possibly linked with monument building, possibly linked with for example, the imbibement of certain hallucinogenic drinks.
Or just getting pissed with your friends.
Well, exactly. What hemp actually, hemp was in there. They found hemp residue in the beakers. So I find that really interesting. That actually, what we're seeing here is arguably a reinforcement of some of the ideas that people like Vere Gordon Child were proponents of. A culture historical model. And yet at the same time, in other parts of archaeology, that is absolutely not the case. People can have material culture without being of a certain group of people. For example, the way that Hellenism spreads to the east from Greece into Anatolia. You have this Alexander the Great, for example, wouldn't necessarily be Greek. Yeah. From a Greek perspective. So I find it interesting how this slots into archaeological theory.
Oh yeah, and we could point to many examples in our own lives. I mean, I've got a television I think is made in Korea, but I'm not Korean. It's identity in a modern world with modern transport links and so on is a much more fluid thing. People have much more opportunity to meet people from other cultures and form relationships with people from other cultures and have children and with increasingly rich and diverse genetic and cultural heritages. On the other hand, of course, some people see that as a threat and reach back to that perceived past as a sort of as a safe space that they can go to avoid the challenges of the present. It can be argued. I think you were talking about Gordon Child and somewhat. What I think is also worth pointing out that you can argue that there was a generation or couple of generations of archaeologists post World War II who were uncomfortable with the idea that certainly parts of the past, particularly parts of the prehistoric past where there weren't written records, exhibited the same levels of violence as modern societies. The argument went
sort of an Eden England in the Neolithic. Yes,
precisely. The idea was that because there were no known cultural centres, towns, cities that could be the centres of political organisations, which then would be aggressive, expansive, whatever. There was no need for violence within society. The groups within society could coexist peacefully.
Yes,
there's now increasing evidence that actually that's nonsense.
No, exactly. There's evidence for Neolithic warfare. There's evidence
absolutely.
for small pockets of horrible certain things like mass graves possibly occurring here and there. But also, absolutely. Something else that I just realised that this reinforces. This research also reinforces that Early Man, the Nick Park movie, it's right. This Frenchman comes in and goes, "The Age of Stone is over." It is exactly what happened. Because actually, it's funny here. So we have Mike Parker Pearson talking about how these were the people who brought an end to the Stone Age. They essentially came in to a Neolithic which was separated from the continent. Unfortunately, the article here, the journalist uses the phrase "a Neolithic Brexit." It's not necessarily the best analogy to use, but Mike Parker, exactly. Parker Pearson says the Beaker people are not prepared to collaborate on enormous labour mobilising projects in the same way that Neolithic people had been, and Bronze Age people, to a certain extent, the early Bronze Age people had been. Their society is more decentralised. So even though bronze had made it to Britain, it seems that then after that came a sort of a new cultural attitude. Parker Pearson said, we don't have a good expression for it, but the Americans do, and that is that nobody is willing to work for the man. And maybe that's it. Maybe what we're seeing is like a 1960s, people coming in with their beakers and their hemp and not wanting to work for the centralized man. You know, obviously I'm joking, but it's interesting how we are absolutely seeing a wave of humanity, and that is what then feeds into what I suppose feeds into those groups of people that people are more comfortable trying to link themselves to in an identity sense. People.
There's also another. Far be it for me to quarrel with a point of view put forward by Mark Parker Pearson, whose work is fascinating and he's done some really. And some of his insights too. But there's another reading of it, which is that what you have, and it's a very unfashionable reading, but what you have is what you have in the Homeric myths and in later Celtic mythology as well, which is the heroic society that expresses its identity through fighting and then feasting, which is able to replace that previous culture that is alluded to in the Neolithic, that builds the monumental structures, and moves to a different way of organising society. And what we see,
well, and in that sense, actually, it could be an influence more than just it, because the article does also go on to say that this wasn't a great horde jumping in boats en masse. This is a very long and slow process of migration. And so actually, and again, you sort of see this also reflected, for example, in the Iron Age, when before the Romans actually arrived formally, people were being Romanized already. There were sort of town structures coming into Britain, a wine trade, coinage, this kind of thing. The continental influence was there.
Absolutely. There are very few books set in the Bronze Age, but one of my all-time favourites is a book by Rose McSuckler called Warrior Scarlet, which is, and she very deliberately, again, she moved in archaeological circles, she talked to archaeologists, she read archaeology when she researched her books. And in the 1950s, she postulated this idea of, looking at the Cuchulainn stories, for example, of Finn McCool on the one side, and the Homeric myths on the other, and saying, look, Bronze Age Britain could have been like this. But there's a wonderful moment when the chieftain of the Bronze Age tribe is feasting the elite warriors, and a travelling smith visits, and he's got a small sheath knife, but the blade is silver, not coloured, not bronze. Iron has just arrived, and he challenges someone to strike it with their bronze dagger, and they're doing it. It's a wonderful literary moment.
It is, except that we know that wouldn't have happened. It was perfect up until the challenge, because it's what we know of the Iron Age arriving is that it was likely to do with the exotic material. Everyone's stopping and going, oh, what's that? I need that. Whereas we know that the early iron daggers and the bronze daggers were much better because early iron smithing wasn't up to scratch yet. So great metaphor, falls down at the end, sadly.
It was literature, not a PhD thesis.
Okay.
But what it does do is illustrate possible mechanisms, interactions. One of the things that that particularly, I think novelists like Sutcliffe can bring to these kind of stories, and one of the things she did bring to was the idea of a continuity, that people and cultures happen within a landscape, and that to a greater or lesser extent there was continuity and as well as change. And one of the things that we do as archaeologists is try and measure how much is continuity and how much is change, and the balance is often changing more and more often actually as we get more evidence.
And sometimes in unexpected ways. And I think this whole bank of assertions that's come out of this research relating to cheddar man, but through to this idea of this question of what modern Britain, where modern Britain came from, certainly the Iron Age and onwards came from, has been. This is the reason February was so interesting, I think, from an archaeological standpoint.